We can trace UFO sightings as far as human memory goes. Throughout the history, there were reports of strange things in the sky, as well as strange unearthly creatures visiting our planet. World governments are still conducting secret investigations, and some of the UFO researchers claim they are collaborating with alien visitors. There are so many interesting UFO cases, and it's not easy to pick just one, but today we're gonna talk about maybe lesser known case of mystery airships of 1897. But before we start, please subscribe or you may get abducted by aliens. Mystery airships or phantom airships are a class of unidentified flying objects best known for a series of newspaper reports originating in the western United States and spreading east during late 1896 and early 1897. According to researcher Jerome Clark, airship sightings were reported worldwide during the 1880s and 1890s. Mystery airship reports are seen as a cultural predecessor to modern claim of extraterrestrial piloted flying saucer-style UFOs. Typical airship report involved nighttime sighting of unidentified light, but more detailed accounts reported ships comparable to dirigible. Reports of the alleged crewmen and pilots usually describe them as human-looking, although sometimes the crew claimed to be from Mars. It was popularly believed that the mystery airship were the product of some inventor of genius who was not ready to make knowledge of his creation public. For example, Thomas Edison was so widely speculated to be the mind behind the alleged airship that in 1897 he was forced to issue a strongly worded statement denying his responsibility. It has been frequently argued that mystery airships are unlikely to represent test flights of real human-manufactured dirigibles, as no record of successful sustained or long-range airship flights are known from the period, and it would have been impossible, not to mention irrational, to keep such a thing a secret. To the contrary, however, there were in fact several functional airships manufactured before the 1896, but their capabilities were far more limited than the mysterious airships. Rees and others note that contemporary American newspapers of the yellow journalism era were more likely to print manufactured story and hoaxes than are modern news sources, and editors of the late 1800s often would have expected the reader to understand that such stories were false. Most journalists of the period did not seem to take the airship reports very seriously. As after the major 1896 wave concluded, the subject quickly fell from public consciousness. The airship stories received further attention only after the 1896 newspaper reports were largely rediscovered in the mid-1960s, and UFO investigators suggested that airships might represent earlier precursors to post-World War II UFO sightings. The best known of the mystery airship waves began in California in 1896. Afterwards, reports and accounts of similar airship came from other areas, generally moving eastward across the country. Some accounts during this wave of airship reports claim that occupants were visible on some airship, and encounters with the pilots were reported as well. These occupants often appeared to be human, though their behavior, mannerism and clothing were somewhat reported as unusual. Sometimes the apparent humans claimed to be from the planet Mars. Historian Mike Dash described and summarized the 1896-1897 series of airship sightings, writing, Not only were the mysterious airship bigger, faster, and more robust than anything that produced by the aviators of the world, they seemed to be able to fly enormous distances, and some were equipped with the giant wings. The 1896-1897 airship wave is probably the best investigated of all historical anomalies. The files of almost 1,500 newspapers from across the United States has been combined for reports, an astonishing feat of research. The general conclusion of investigators was that a considerable number of the simpler sightings were misidentification of planes and stars, and a large number of the more complex the results of hoaxes and practical jokes. A small residue remains perplexing. The Sacramento Bee and the San Francisco Call reported the first sighting on November 18, 1896. Witnesses reported a light moving slowly over Sacramento onto the evening of November 17 at estimate 1,000-foot elevation. Some witnesses said they could see a dark shape behind the light. A witness named Lowry reported that he heard a voice from the craft issuing commands to increase elevation in order to avoid hitting a church sleep. Lowry added, in what was no doubt a mean as a wink to the reader, that he believed that apparent captain to be referring to the tower of a local brewery, as there were no churches nearby. Lowry further described the craft as being powered by two men exerting themselves on bicycle pedals. Above the pedaling men seemed to be a passenger compartment, which lay under the main body of the dirigible. A light was mounted on the front end of the airship. Some witnesses reported the sound of singing as the craft passes overhead. The November 19, 1896 edition of the Stockton, California Daily Mail featured one of these earliest accounts of an alleged alien craft sighting. Colonel Shaw claimed that while driving his buggy through the countryside near Stockton, he came across what appeared to be a landed spacecraft. Shaw described it as having a metal surface which was completely featureless, apart from a rudder and pointed ends. He estimated a diameter of 25 feet and said that the vessel was around 150 feet in total length. The slender 7-foot-tall apparent extraterrestrials were said to approach from the craft while emitting a strange vibrating noise. The beings reportedly examined Shaw's buggy and then tried to physically force him to accompany them back to the airship. The aliens were said to give up after realizing they lacked the physical strength to force Shaw aboard. They supposedly fled back to their ship, which lifted off the ground and sped out of sight. Shaw believed that these beings were Martians sent to kidnap an Earthling for unknown but potentially nefarious purposes. This had been seen by some as an early attempt of alien abduction. It is apparently the first published account of explicitly extraterrestrial beings attempting to kidnap humans into their spacecraft. Here are some unbelievable reports of the sightings. The mystery light reappeared over Sacramento on the evening of November 21st. It was also seen over Folsom, San Francisco, Oakland, Modesto, Manteca, and some other cities later that same evening, as was reportedly viewed by hundreds of witnesses. One witness from Arkansas, allegedly a former state senator Harris, was supposedly told by an airship pilot during the tension leading up to the Spanish-American War that the craft was bound for Cuba to use its Hotchkiss gun to kill Spaniards. In one account from Texas, 3 men reported an encounter with an airship and with 5 strangely dressed men, who asserted they were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel and had learned English from the 1553 North Pole expedition led by Hugh Willoughby. On February 2, 1897, the Omaha Bee reported an airship sighting over Hastings, Nebraska the previous day. An article in the Albinon Weekly News reported that 2 witnesses saw an airship crash just inches from where they were standing. The airship suddenly disappeared with a man standing where the vessel has been. The airship pilot showed the man a small device that supposedly enabled him to shrink the airship small enough to store the vessel in the pocket. A rival newspaper, the Wilsonville Review, playfully claimed that its own editor was additional witness to the incident and that he heard the pilot saying, "The phrase he allegedly heard is 'subscribe for the Review' spelled backwards." On April 10, 1897, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a story reporting that one W. H. Hopkins encountered a grounded airship about 20 feet in length and 8 feet in diameter near the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri. The vehicle was apparently propelled by 3 large propellers and crewed by a beautiful nude woman and bearded man, also nude. Hopkins attempted with some difficulty to communicate with the crew in order to ascertain their origins. Eventually they understood what Hopkins was asking of them, and they both pointed to the sky and uttered something that sounded like the word Mars. On April 16, 1897, a story published by the Table Rock Argus claimed that a group of anonymous but reliable witnesses have seen an airship sailing overhead. The craft has many passengers. The witnesses claim that among these passengers was a woman tied to a chair, a woman attending her, and a man with a pistol guarded their apparent prisoner. Before the witnesses thought to contact the authorities, the airship was already gone. An account from Aurora, Texas, related in the Dallas Morning News on April 19, 1897, reported that a couple of days before, an airship had smashed into a windmill, later determined to be a sump pump belonging to a Judge Proctor, then crashed. The occupant was dead and mangled, but the story reported that the presumed pilot was clearly not an inhabitant of this world. Strange hieroglyphic figures were seen on the wreckage, which resembled a mixture of aluminium and silver. It must have weighed several tons. In the 20th century, unusual metallic material recovered from the presumed crash site was shown to contain a percentage of aluminium and iron amixed. The story ended by noting that the pilot was given a Christian burial in the town cemetery. In 1973, MUFON investigators discovered the alleged stone marker used in this burial. Their metal detectors indicated a quantity of foreign material might remain buried there. However, they were not permitted to exhume, and when they returned several years later, the headstone and whatever metallic material had laid beneath it was gone. An account by Alexander Hamilton of Leroy, Kansas, supposedly occurred around April 19, 1897, and was published in the Yates Center Farmer Advocate on April 23. Hamilton, his son, and an attendant witnessed an airship hovering over his cattle pen. Upon closer examination, the witnesses realized that the red cable from the airship has lassoed a heifer, but has also become entangled in the pen's fence. After trying unsuccessfully to free the heifer, Hamilton cut loose a portion of the fence, then stood in amazement to see the ship, cow, and all rise slowly and sail off. Some have suggested that this was the earliest report of cattle mutilation. In 1982, however, UFO researcher Jerome Clark debunked this story and confirmed via interviews and Hamilton's own affidavit that the story was a successful attempt to win a Liars Club competition to create the most outlandish tale. In 1868, Charles Fort sighted a mystery airship sighting in Sopiapo, Chile. It was described as a gigantic shining bird driven by a noisy motor. In a variation of the usual airship, on July 29, 1880, two witnesses in Louisville, Kentucky, saw a flying object described as a man surrounded by machinery, which he seemed to be working with his hands, with wings protruding from his back. Merely a month later, a similar sighting happened in New Jersey. It was written at the New York Times that it was apparently a man with the bat wings and improved frog's legs. The monster waved his wings in answer to the whistle of the locomotive. There were a number of mystery airship reports from the east coast of the US in 1887. There was a series of mystery airship sightings in 1908 in New England, New Zealand and some European locations. Later reports came from the United Kingdom in 1912 and 1913. However, by this time airship technology was well advanced. Count Friedrich von Zeppelin has been flying his massive passenger-carrying airship for nearly a decade by then, making the prospect that these may have been small private airships rather than evidence of extraterrestrial visitation or newspaper hoaxes more reasonable. Wally Stillingast, a Massachusetts businessman, gained notoriety for claims he was responsible for the 1909 wave due to an airship he had built, but his claims were never substantiated. Jerome Clark writes, "One curious feature of the post-1887 airship waves was the failure of each to stick in historical memory. Although 1909, for example, brought a flood of sightings worldwide and attended discussion and speculation, contemporary accounts do not allude to the hugely publicized event of little more than a decade earlier." Clarks writes that any attempt to uncover the truth about the late 19th century airship scare comes up against some unhappy realities. Newspaper coverage was unreliable. No independent investigator spoke directly with alleged witnesses or attempted to verify or debunk their testimony, and with a single unsatisfactory exception, no eyewitnesses was ever interviewed even in the 1950s, when some were presumably still living. The single unsatisfactory exception Clark cites is a former San Francisco Chronicle employee interviewed by Edward J. Ruppelt in 1952. Ruppelt wrote that the man had been a copyboy and remembered the incident, but time had cancelled out the details. He did tell me that he, the editor of the paper, and the news staff have seen the ship, as he referred to the UFO. His story, even though it was 56 years old, smack of others I've heard, when he said that no one of the newspapers ever told anyone what they have seen. They didn't want people to think they were crazy. Job notes, most arguments against the airship idea came from individuals who assumed that the witnesses did not see what they claimed to see. This is the crucial link between the 1896 phenomenon and the modern unidentified flying object phenomenon beginning in 1947. In 2009, American author J. Alan Danalek wrote a book entitled The Great Airship of 1897, in which he made the case that the mystery airship was the work of an unknown individual, possibly founded by a wealthy investor from San Francisco to build an airship prototype as a test vehicle for a later series of larger passenger-carrying airship. In the work, Danilek demonstrates how the craft might have been built using materials and technologies available in 1896. The ship Danilek proposes was built in secret to safeguard its design, as well as to protect investors in case of failure. Noting that the flights were initially seen over California and other later over the Midwest, he speculates that the inventor was making a series of short test flights moving from west to east and following the main railway lines for logistical support, and that it was these experimental flights that formed the basis for many, though not all, of the newspaper accounts from the era. Danelek also noticed that the reports ended abruptly in mid-April 1897, suggesting that the craft may have met with disaster, efficiently ending the venture and permitting the sightings to fall into the realm of mythology. During the 1896 wave, there were many attempts to explain the airship sightings, including suggestions of hoaxes, pranks, publicity stunts, and hallucinations. One man suggested that airships were swarms of lightning beetles, misidentified by observers. Jacobs believed that many airship tales originated with enterprising reporters perpetrating journalistic hoaxes. He notes that many of these accounts are easy to identify because of their tongue-in-cheek tone and accent to the sensational. Furthermore, in many such newspapers' hoaxes, the author makes his intention obvious by saying in the last line that he was writing from an insane asylum. Early sources citing the extraterrestrial hypothesis, all from 1897, include the Washington Times with speculation that the airships were partly from Mars, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which suggested of the airship, these may be visitors from Mars, fearful at least of invading the planet they have been seeking. In 1909, a letter printed in the Otago Daily Times New Zealand suggested that the mystery airship sightings then began reported in the country were due to Martian atomic-powered spaceships. So, what do you guys think about this interesting case? All hoax, or 1897 was indeed one of the most active years considering UFO visitations? Leave your comments down below. Thank you for stopping by, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.